Constitutional Conversations is a series of discussions by America's leading scholars about the principles, framing, ratification, and implementation of constitutional government in the United States. This series is hosted by the James Madison Memorial Fellowship Foundation of Alexandria, Virginia.
Madison's political career is such an interesting and complex web of varying tendencies. He, of course, is the first truly professional politician in the United States. He never had any other career. Yes, of course, he had the family estate, the family farm, and there was a couple of years he spent there tending to that in the distant way in which one tends to that when everybody else is doing all the work. But he was a professional politician, and he understood himself to be committed to public service, which meant that he often was in the position of making pragmatic judgments, pragmatic commitments and decisions. This is most of all manifest in his presidency. As Secretary of State, he of course was carrying out the objectives of the Jefferson administration, working in partnership with Jefferson, providing leadership to be sure, but nevertheless, it was Jefferson's agenda. And this shows up particularly when we adopt the policy of trying to avoid war in Europe, because British, French, other wars are constantly going on, as they had been going on for the past 15, 20 years. And Jefferson adopted a policy of embargo. So if we can't get them to leave us alone, then we will leave them alone. They can't send anything in here, we won't send anything out there. Our ships won't be prey on the oceans. We'll stay free of their entanglements. That embargo policy was inherited by Madison, and it failed. It failed to keep the United States out of war, which we know from the War of 1812. But it failed also because it didn't sufficiently establish protection for American commercial interests and created tensions within the society that were difficult to manage. Well, Madison therefore sets out in his administration having to change course on policies that he had helped with Jefferson to put into place in the first place. He continued in his administration having to come to terms with the realization that politics couldn't simply follow theoretical propriety. So he ends up having to go to Congress to lead the United States into war in 1812, against all intention and all purpose. But pragmatically, he had no choice. Similarly, he had to approve the Second Bank of the United States because it was a thing the country needed, particularly in the aftermath of the war when there was some need to establish stability in currency and in the system for handling debt in the United States. And he therefore approved it against the background previously of having thought it unconstitutional. So there are a series of such decisions that were necessary, that had to be made, that we can call pragmatic because they occur in context in which it seems that one is almost compelled. But I would never go so far as to say they are merely pragmatic. I think Madison always accepted the obligation to defend his conduct on principle, always. That was perhaps the most consistent aspect of his life, that he would, whether privately or publicly, give a defense in principle of what he'd done, so that even if it entailed adaptation or change, he would still be there to defend it. One of the areas in which you will find this to be perhaps most problematic, and yet another way most informative, is to recognize that on the question of slavery, James Madison came to the conviction that slavery was wrong. He expressed this in the Constitutional Convention, in the First Congress of the United States. He celebrated the limitation on the foreign slave trade to be put in place in 1808 as an expression of the country's sentiment with regard to the inhumanity of slavery. So he came to the conviction that slavery was wrong, but James Madison was a slaveholder, and he never freed his slaves. He had friends and associates, Governor Cole, who took his slaves, freed them, and Madison praised him for it, though he doubted whether it was altogether wise. Now, why did he doubt that it was altogether wise to free the slaves? I said he always defended his principles. He became convinced that slavery was wrong. Why was he not certain slaves should be freed? Madison came to the conviction that the prejudice of color was ineradicable in the United States. And he thought, therefore, that there was no way whatever there could be peaceful existence between the slaves and the slaveholders in the United States, between blacks and whites. And therefore, he could not see any way to enter into a process of trying to establish relationships that could only eventuate in destruction and disorder. So for the same reason, he became a president of the Colonization Society. He sought to advance a form of abolition which was conditioned upon removing the freed, the manumitted slaves from the country, or at least far enough away from the settled portion of the country that there would be no interaction between the two peoples. So that's another example where his principles are clear, but the context in which you have to apply them can be difficult and complex and force you into decisions that aren't necessarily, from an abstract point of view, considered ideal.
Constitutional Conversations is made possible by a generous grant from the Fairleigh S. Dickinson Jr. Foundation. Constitutional Conversations is made possible by the James Madison Education Fund.